You know, first of all, just the simplest question. What is it you love about this book?
I'm not sure love is the appropriate question to use in reference to a thing. A book, for example. I think that love and hate is something that goes on between individuals. Now, what is it I like about this book? That's different. I like the fact, at least to me, it is the most interesting book. I studied philosophy at the University of Kansas, and it is the most interesting book that I have ever read. Now, I can never remember not believing in God and life after death. So I was a perfect candidate for reading the Urantia book. I started right at the beginning, and I thought back then, and I had read the Koran, I read the Bible, I read the Book of Mormon, and the Bhagavad Gita, and the Urantia book has held my interest to this day. I've probably read it 20 or 25 times.
So, what faith tradition were you raised in?
I was raised a Presbyterian. I was in the choir. We had Boy Scout meetings down there. And the entire family went to the Presbyterian Church in Northeast Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
How did you first come across this book?
I was at the University of Kansas. I was a freshman. I was in a fraternity, and one of my fraternity brothers told me about the Urantia book. I started reading his book and then went down and bought my own copy at a downtown Lawrence, Kansas bookstore. And the name of the bookstore was Keeler's Bookstore. That's my last name. But no blood relationship.
What intrigued you about this book? You were reading with who were you reading with? Who introduced it to you?
The person?
Yeah.
I was reading on my own, but the person who loaned me his copy, I started reading his copy before I went and bought my own copy, was Vern Grimsley. There were 8 of us at that fraternity who became readers of the Urantia book and continue to read until this day. Actually, 2 of them are deceased now.
Wow. So
out of 70 guys, that 8, that was more than 10%, wasn't it? But after we left, then that was notwithstanding that I told everybody. The last chapter meeting we had, I told everyone about the Urantia book, and of course encouraged them to read it. If somebody is a truth seeker and spiritual explorer, then it should definitely, in my opinion, be on their reading list.
So we're going back to like 1959. You have found this book that at that time is 4 years old. Or it's been out and prep for 4 years.
True.
What was its draw to you, and what made you think this is what it says it is?
2 reasons, I think, since you ask. Number 1 was an intellectual reason. It made intellectual sense to me. And the other reason, so that was in a way, if you see your brain as a little bit, well, it is external to the rest of the body. And then my sense as a reader of the Urantia book is that also something inside of me resonated. I choose to think it was the thought adjuster, Spirit of Truth, that said, this this is it, or this is the way, or what you're going to read in here is true. What it claims to be is a reality.
You had been raised a Christian, and here you have a book that talks about Jesus in a very new and unusual way, perhaps. How did you respond to that?
Christian fundamentalists had a meeting, I think, in about 1890. And there are 4 tenets of fundamental Christianity. Number 1 is that Mary was a virgin, that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. The third would be, not necessarily in this order, the third would be the atonement doctrine, that he died for our sins. And number 4 is that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. And with all 4 of those, I guess not the second, no, even the second person of the Trinity, those 4 fundamental beliefs on the part of Christianity or fundamentalist Christians, I had trouble accepting. In fact, I rejected. And do to this day. Sometimes I tune in to Christian. There's a station that tends to be rather fundamentalistic that I listen to sometimes, and when they go off on one of those 4 fundamentals, which intellectually I understand, but personally I'm not tolerant of. I choose not to accept.
So, I'm breaking from the questions, of course, because I'm very interested in, you came to this very building in what year for the first time?
1962, March of 1962. Martin Myers and Martin had become a reader. I left my book with a light on it. There was a very quiet place there at the fraternity house down in the basement, and I left on purpose. I left my book on a table, and there was a light on us, and I left it open. And Martin Myers chose to scan quickly what he was seeing there, I guess, and checked out a few pages and decided that this is a book that would interest him. I wrote Urantia Foundation and requested a meeting with somebody at the foundation. We had no idea who we would be meeting. And when we arrived, the receptionist escorted back and introduced us to a man whose name was Dr. Sadler. And Dr. Sadler began to explain in a rather, well, we kept asking questions, but I would say it was at least 4 hours and maybe 5 hour exchange that we had. We were asking a question and answer session. We were asking the questions and he was answering them.
Was he curious that these 2 guys from Lawrence, Kansas had found this book and had come up to Chicago to figure out what it was all about? Or did that even, what do you think this meeting was about? What was going on here?
They were hungry at that time. I went back that summer of '62 and there was a meeting here at 533. There were so many persons attending that meeting, but to us at the time, they were older persons. And the meeting in the forum room, they had people seated on one side of an L, and then another room that went off, well, it depends where you were standing, but another room went off to one side, and people were seated there, also in a row. So that a lot of these people couldn't, maybe if they were on the front row, but these people couldn't see each other, and the person who was speaking was in front at the apex of that L. And what was the question?
Well,
they...
Dr. Sadler, but you hear two young college students have come up there to find out about this book.
He and they, the reason I mentioned that meeting in the summer, they just hugged us, they embraced us, they were so pleased. It was like they were hungry for young people. They were beginning to be so concerned that this was going to die out, because they thought the book was going to sell out like hotcakes. It took 12 years to sell out those first 10,000 copies. And they thought the first year it was 1,800. Then the next year it was about half that. And in 1958, there were only 3 books sold, and it took 12 years to sell out those 10,000 copies. Now, the Spanish translation, on the other hand, when we printed it, put it this way, in 10 years, we had sold over 125,000 copies of the Spanish translation. And at the rate we're selling the Urantia book in Russia, the Russians in a 10-year period they're going at a rate of about 30,000 copies. Oh, and the Portuguese translation also is selling. The Portuguese, or the Brazilians rather, have said, well, we're going to outsell, in the first 10 years, we will outsell the Spanish-speaking people. We are more hungry. We ask people in South America, in Mexico, Central and South America, and Spain, why are people buying so many copies of the Urantia book? And they said, among others, but the main reason seemed to be that the Catholic Church made them spiritually thirsty, but insufficiently quenched their thirst.
So, you have been reading it all this time. Does it still seem new to you? Does the book still feel new to you? Or is it beginning to feel like a relic?
No. When I go back and read it again, I sometimes think, wait a minute, that wasn't there last time I read this. They are adding things to my book. But I do think that of course, what is happening is it was always there, but I wasn't comprehending it, or I wasn't ready for any profound comprehension. So every time I go back and read it, now I'm doing something. This is reading through the Urantia book this time, I'm understanding it better than I ever have before. I wish I were with a group doing the same thing. I'll read half a paper in the morning, half of the evening. I started at the foreword, and I just read it over and over again, just the foreword, for example, and then just paper 1, and then just paper 2. And I did it until I felt saturated. Generally after, I think probably it's close to 10 times that I read it, and then I feel saturated with it, at which time I move on to the next paper and do the same thing.
What kind of insights are you getting these days with it?
Well, let me put it this way. Let's see. Here's one. This was one of the biggies last year. And it had to do, somebody in our study group mentioned this, said that that belief fixates and faith liberates. And then I went and found it in the Urantia book. There was a complete paragraph, which if I were really pressed, I might be able to. Anyway, it's the best explanation I've ever heard of belief and faith. And the Urantia book, in this conversation I had with the person who talked about difference between belief and faith and fixates and liberates, we, in our discussion, decided, well, we're another belief system. The Urantia book is another belief system. And if we believed that, which we did, I think, then we had to accept that it's the Mormons think they have the best belief system. I assume the Muslims do, and the Jews do, and the Presbyterians do, and the Baptists have the best belief system. And did I say, and we, as readers of the Urantia book, think that we have a very superior belief system. Of course, the Urantia book says that there are truths in all religion, and I guess we think there are somewhat more truths for us that read it and read it repeatedly. But it is a belief system. And there is something on top of, in the town I grew up in, there was an Episcopal church that had a spire at the top, and then there was a cross at the very top. And the belief system, to use that church, can see it right now in my mind's eye, the belief system is kind of like that, the church of brick and mortar. And that spire that goes out the top, it's a good foundation to have the belief system, in my opinion. I define what's good as anything that brings God and man closer together. And anything that's bad is that which does just the opposite. And the Urantia book has been a powerful instrument to bring God and me, at least that's my subjective sense of it, to bring us together. But for a long time, now mind you, I studied philosophy. For a long time, it was an intellectual trip, a very, very stimulating intellectual trip. But there's something, that realm of faith that transcends mind, the level up there of the Spirit. Remember that Jesus talked about we live on the level of the flesh, the level of emotions, the level of the mind, the level of brotherly love, the moral level, and the level of the Spirit. And my sense is that I have at least begun to, I think, it's my subjective evaluation, I have begun to transcend the belief system as I have more regularly incorporated prayerful and worshipful meditation. Gard Jameson asked me years ago about a statement in the Urantia book, and the statement is, worship is the highest privilege and first duty of all created intelligences. Are you worshiping regularly? And I said, no. And he said, do you believe what you read in the Urantia book? And I said, yes. And he said, I think you should incorporate some prayerful, worshipful meditation in your daily, in your behavior. And he recommended also that I go to the Self-Realization Center. I was living in Southern California, quite close to the Self-Realization Center. And he recommended that course, the TM course. I took that, and I have been engaged since that time in prayerful, worshipful meditation. And I think, if not the most valuable thing I have ever done or started doing, in the case of the worship meditation, prayerful, worshipful meditation is what I call it. It's definitely in the top 3, and I think it's number 1 of the top 3. I'd have to give that some thought, but yeah, I would check it right now, right this instant, if I had to decide. It's number 1.
So, what can this book do for the world?
It can transform individuals, make them more conscious of, which would be an intellectual thing, but also transformative. It could transform them with some things that are intangible and invisible, and some of the most real things in our existence, in my opinion, and those things are love and goodness and truth. And if people personalize, internalize what's in the Urantia book and get in touch with the spark of divinity, ember of eternity within them, then not just their mind, but their entire being will be transformed. I say that from personal experience, but also it is my profound conviction that would happen, and those would become the most important, to grow more God conscious, to grow more experiencing of goodness, truth, love. And if we internalize that, then it would eventually transform the world.
All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Anything else you wanted to put on video? That's fantastic.
Anything else you want?
Well, sometime I want you to give us kind of a tour of this building.
Okay, I'll do that. You did ask one question.
Yeah.
You said in a phrase, in a one word, if possible,
right,
define the Urantia book. I thought, since I knew you were going to ask that question, I came up with, and I haven't come up with anything better, with the 2 words, answer book. The Urantia book is the answer book.
Excellent. Which it is.
Finish?
Yep, done.